transition finance in partnership with GIP Africa. This is the first, but certainly not the last, webinar in partnership with GIP, Bank of Africa, and 91 that I welcome as well. We are delighted to have you join us today as we explore the opportunities and the challenges that lies ahead in this vital area of sustainable finance. So the topic of transition finance is indeed a critical concept that emerged in the past years and is a pivotal element of our collective effort to fight climate change and facilitate the shift towards sustainable economy. So while much of the focus has been on green, pure green activities, transition finance encompasses a larger spectrum supporting the entire economy shift towards lower emissions and climate resilience. And this is particularly relevant for Africa, where balancing development needs with sustainability goals is paramount. So to analyze these issues, I am delighted to be joined by a panel of experts here in person and virtually. So thank you for being here with us. So throughout our discussion today, we hope to emphasize the importance of reframing the narrative around sustainability in Africa, and it is because it is essential to shift our focus from purely green projects to a more integrated approach that considers the continent development priorities as well. I also encourage all participants to engage actively in today's discussions with our questions. So without any further ado, I am turning first to Mr. Karim El Ayanoui, Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South, for the first opening remarks.
Thank you, Rahim. And it's a pleasure to be with you, and I see many friends here, and welcome to our partners to this event. As you know, this is a topic that has been at the forefront of what we do at the Policy Center for the New South, but also in the policy debates here in Morocco, but as well as in Africa in particular. The dimension, the financial dimension, the funding, the mechanisms, the regulation, the regulatory framework that is in place today to contribute to a swifter, more efficient, broader, at scale financing of the transition challenges, I have to say, is not in place. We don't have today the mechanisms. We have the institutions in Africa. There's a quite well-developed financial sector. At the world level, it's a sector that innovates, and sometimes too much, and it costs us a couple of crises over the past 20 years. But today we don't have the appropriate framework. I think this is not a topic only for the private sector. It means that all actors should be very well coordinated, including regulatory bodies in advanced economies as well as in the developing world. And unfortunately, today we don't have also, I would say, the political sort of will for this to be organized in a broad, coordinated way. As you know, we have a sort of fragmented world geopolitically, which also affects, of course, the policies and particularly the regulatory framework. So there is an important role to be played by multilateral development banks in coordination with the private sector. There are initiatives, there are interesting projects that are being financed, but it's not at scale, and it's not at par with the challenges, and also in what we have to deliver for the population and for the world. As you know, and I'll conclude briefly on that, the challenges, the developmental challenges around the world are twofold, or the drivers to sustainable growth and broader growth, inclusive growth, have two levers, basically. It's basically financing the transition, and all it has to do with this transition, innovation, research, development, etc. And of course, a faster development in Africa. So these are the engine of growth at the global level. So there is an interest, a common interest at the global level to sort of better organize this transition, and particularly its financing, which is a major constraint today for developing worlds, in particularly green infrastructure, which is costly projects, needs expertise. It has long-term returns that are social returns that are often public goods by nature. And so the architecture, the financing of that, if I speak about Africa, where we're lagging behind on average at the continental level, is an essential dimension. So just to sum up, an enough sort of not under par coordination, finance that is not at scale and not delivering coordination mechanisms between all the stakeholders and the actors, but it is a fantastic opportunity to create, to foster growth at the global level, both leveling up Africa's development and financing its transition, but more at the global level. So you can count on the commitment of the Policy Center on those issues. We have been working steadily over the past 10 years. Beyond that, also to sectoral approaches that are sort of more detailed work at the continental level and sometimes at the country level. So once again, great to have you with us, and thank you for your following us.
Thank you very much. I am now turning to Mr. Brahim Benjelloun-Touimi, who is member of the board and delegate general manager at Bank of Africa, BMCE Group, and co-chair of GIP Africa, for our second welcoming remarks. Can you please turn on your mic?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam. Dear President and friends, Karim, dear Mr. Majjoun, Minister Boussa, dear supporters and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor, and I'm delighted as co-chair of GIP Africa Chapter, alongside Hendrik Dutoit and his team from 91 to be part of this second capacity building webinar organized in proud partnership with the Policy Center for the New South. Well, it has been 2 years since we teamed up to launch GIP Africa Chapter at COP27 in Egypt through a joint effort between Bank of Africa and 91, because we were both driven by common purpose of adding an emerging market lens on the ongoing global sustainability effort. We are indeed, and Dr. Majjoun is behind that, a network. GIP is a network, a hub to partner with practitioners and reflecting on the best way to channel capital to a transition. And I would like here, before ending my introductory remark, my personal conviction and a proposal, I would like to reassert the objective that has been laid earlier by our moderator. We have to build on the GIP Transition Finance paper published in Dubai in partnership with the Mercial team, and build on the G20 2022 Sustainable Finance Working Group report, which calls for development and scaling up transition finance globally, the outcomes of the first GIP Africa Chapter Advisory Board meeting in London in May 23, and of course have the key takeaways of from discussions with key players. As hinted by Karim and probably by our various keynote speakers and all those who will intervene in this webinar. Many financing challenges remain in Africa. These include perceptions of high risks, lack of viable, sustainable investment and assessment framework, underdeveloped project pipelines, and also concerns over green or transition washing. And furthermore, the recent 2024 Sustainable Development Report published by the UN Sustainable Development Solution Network last June highlights that on average globally, only 16%, 1/6 of the SDG targets are on track to be achieved by 2030, with the remaining 84 demonstrating limited or reversal of progress, with the global south, including Africa, lagging far behind. The kind of SDG which are lagging behind are hunger, zero hunger, peace and strong institutions, the preservation and restoration of the land ecosystem, and health and welfare for all. However, we do not only see these challenges, we feel that these challenges, if appropriately addressed, present numerous opportunities for our continent, boosted by our common ambition to customize sustainable and impact finance models to fit local contents. So the concept note has already stated that our today's webinar serves to not only disseminate the key findings of the transition finance paper, as I said earlier, but also to be a platform for collective reflection and discussion on reframing the narrative, shifting the focus, it has been said earlier, from purely green project to a broader approach that integrates Africa's development imperative, highlight opportunity to develop new blended finance instruments such as transition bonds, loans, funds that can drive sustainable growth in Africa, and emphasizing, it has been said also, partnership, particularly related to Africa integration into global financial markets and the role of initiative such as GIP Africa and Peace and Policy Center New South in fostering innovation and policy reform. I said earlier, it was the formal introductory remarks. I would like to just conclude with personal conviction and a proposal. My personal conviction, aside from a role of co-chair of GIP Africa, is to consider that probably for us, we Africans, transition finance is rather the mainstream finance for us, i.e., I mean that it will be probably enduring finance for us, because we're lagging behind the rest of the world. I'm saying rather will be in the emerging markets, even though we're reflecting within often the emerging market framework. So this is the genuine face of finance for our continent, this transition finance, because it has indeed the advantage of not only trying to lower and get to the net zero emissions and climate resilience, but at the same time, pursue the other SDGs and the goals, of course, of the Paris Agreement. This is very important. So it will last, and we better consider, we Africans, that it will be with us for years and years. My second point, and finish with this proposal, is that let's say, a dream of initiative like GIP and like the things we're doing here in with the policy center and the other initiatives that are behind. And I'm impressed by what GIP Asia is, for example, doing, that always lead us to a kind of an approach, a normative approach that will be shared throughout the world for Africa, a kind of ISO norm, but which will be not only a norm, but also an approach where, because of the specificities of transition finance in Africa, because of the fact, once again, it will be enduring, and that we need at the same time, and Karim, you talked about political will. We need political will. We need regulatory support. We need incentives, structures, tax incentives, subsidies, grants. We need development of financial instruments. I referred earlier to that. Green bonds and transitional bond, blended finance. We need what we try to do, like this webinar, capacity building, education, training programs, public awareness campaign. We need cooperation, like we're doing also today with public and private partnership, collaborative projects, innovation hubs. We need enhancement of risk management tools, be they financial risk or insurance products. We need market development, carbon pricing, carbon taxes. We need sustainable investment platform. What I'm saying is that all what initiative like ourselves, GIP, and with PCNS and other initiatives should go, which should lead at some point of time of having an approach that will be as kind of a toolkit at the disposal of government, of NGOs, of private sector, financial institutions, and gathering, maybe it's a dreaming thing, but gathering all the stakeholders so that instead of having, not instead, but we know that we are in a progress in the present circumstances, but the idea is that we had to have this objective of reaching this kind of a norm as an approach, as a kind of ISO, even if it were under the aegis of the United Nations, so that every country, every corporate, every NGO will have a holistic approach and will have the role and will know the role to play in order to advance into this major endeavor of transition finance, which I consider personally will be around us here in Africa for a long time. Voilà. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for both of you for your insightful welcoming remarks. So now we are turning to the setting the scene section, where our senior fellow, Madame Mounia Bousta, will give us some perspective about a just energy transition in Africa in hopefully 5 minutes.
Thank you, Rim. It's my great pleasure to take part of this webinar. Don't give you the time allocated. I will start with an overview of just transition in the context of African countries. Then I highlight some challenges and opportunities. So over the past decade, the concept of just transition has evolved, offering a new perspective for addressing transition issues, especially in the context of developing countries with more inclusivity and equity. Since 2015, the call for just transition has gained prominence in the international agenda. The International Labour Organization describes it as making the economy greener in an equitable and inclusive way, creating decent work opportunities, and ensuring no one is left behind. So, although the objectives of just transition are the same, regardless of countries' development status, the approaches to achieving it differ significantly. Advanced countries focuses on minimizing the negative impacts for their low carbon policies, while less developed countries are more interested in maximizing their benefit. So if you consider the African context, we have nearly 18% of the world's population are living in Africa, yet the continent accounts for less than 6% of the global energy consumption and less than 3% of carbon emissions. The electrification rate is below 45%, with significant variation between African countries, between urban and rural areas, and this rate also fluctuates due to the impacts of droughts and on hydroelectricity production. So the question is, why should African countries with such low carbon emissions engage in transition process? The answer is clear. African countries face major challenges to meet sustainable development goals that was mentioned in the welcoming remarks, including boosting economic growth, improving living conditions, which depend globally on energy, and increasing resilience to climate change. Since the continent's energy use is largely based on fossil fuels, a just transition is both necessary and challenging, but it also offers great potential. So regarding the opportunities, I will just mention three major or key points. First, with the well-designed policies, the benefits of just transition, such as reduced climate damage, could be up to 5 times greater than the cost of climate mitigation. Second, the just green transition offers significant opportunities to stimulate new growth and employment and to promote the emergence of new sustainable sectors. Third, the energy transition improves access to energy and strengthens the energy, water, food security and access. For example, Morocco has been pursuing a sustainable development policy since 2009. Thanks to its favorable weather conditions, Morocco is committed to investing in order to achieve 52% share of renewable electricity in its energy mix by 2030, and to reduce the importation of fossil fuels, and maybe to become an exporter of energy by developing new fields in green hydrogen. So it's important to note that a transition is not just about changing one industry or process for another. It's about fostering a shift to a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. This new economy requires effective operational capabilities from both public and private actors, along with suitable financing and conditions, including infrastructure, policies, business environments, and other global frameworks. So in terms of challenges, given the political, economic, and social conditions in many African countries, a successful transition is challenging. Prioritizing energy transition projects in regions with significant disparities is very difficult. With the poverty rate of 35.5% across the continent, it's essential to consider Africa's specific context by adopting innovative and more appropriate solutions. Just transition for Africa must go beyond inclusion and equity. It must speed up development. It should help African countries tackle energy, development, and climate issues all at once. African states face major obstacles due to high financial and economic risks and heavy debt burdens. These issues limit their ability to attract private investment and implement policies for development or just transition. So at the end, we need to make significant efforts to accelerate progress using financial tools designed for the African context with the objective of avoiding overburdening the countries involved while considering medium and long-term impacts. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madame Busta. We are now turning to a keynote GIP presentation by Majun, who is co-chair of GIP Steering Committee and chairman of China Green Finance Committee. You also have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. On behalf of GIP Steering Committee, let me start by thanking GIP African Chapter and the Policy Center for the New South for hosting this event. And in particular, my thanks go to Mr. Benjelloun and Mr. Ayanoui. Just by way of introduction, I co-chair the GIP Steering Committee together with Sir William, who is the former City of London mayor. And GIP was launched in 2018 with the purpose of mobilizing more green finance resources for developing country emerging markets. And so far, we have 50 members, which are largest financial institutions from many continents, including from China, from Europe, UK, and a lot of developing economies. And under the GIP, we have set up a few working groups to enhance capacity on risk analysis, on sustainability disclosure, on product innovation, and more recently on transition finance. And the last couple of years, the GIP set up a few regional chapters, including those in Africa, Central Asia, and ASEAN countries to enhance our engagement with local financial institutions and to offer capacity building services. Now, back to the topic of today's discussion with transition finance in Africa. Let me mention the 2022 G20 report, which is the G20 Transition Finance Framework. At that time, I was still the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. So the group was actually spending a lot of time, nearly a year, drafted this framework under the G20 and calling for 5 pillars under the framework to mobilize financing for transition activities, especially those in the carbon-intensive sectors, such as steel, cement, fossil fuel, aviation, shipping, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And these 5 pillars included, number 1, we need a clear definition of transition activities. Number 2, we need to make sure the companies know how to do transition plan and disclose information on their targets. Number 3, innovative financial products. And number 4, incentives from the government to make these transition projects more bankable. And finally, making sure just transition element is included. So in the last few years, I see a lot of countries, jurisdictions implementing elements of this framework, including, for example, in Europe, the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy included a lot of items on transition. And Singapore early this year came up with a taxonomy, which again included the transition items. And in China, more than 10 cities and provinces have launched the transition finance framework. including taxonomy, transition planning, guidance, carbon accounts for firms, and incentives. Now, specifically in some of these pilot cities in China, they offered their local version of transition taxonomies, some with like 100 items, some with 200 items, each providing a description of the qualified transition activities with technical pathways. And also in some cities, which are pilot region for transition finance, they provided a template for companies to produce a transition plan so that they can reduce the cost of doing so. And also, some cities have organized carbon accounts for as many as like 10,000 firms to join this carbon account platform, which means that it can substantially reduce the cost of the firms reporting carbon-related information. And also, some cities in China offered fiscal incentives to transition projects, including in the form of interest subsidies. So some of these were actually working very well. For example, in Huzhou City, which is one of these pilot cities, they have mobilized, I think, as much as 30 billion RMB for transition finance in just something like a 6 months period of time. And now back to Africa, I think Africa has its own features which need to be tackled locally. For example, sector-wise, you're probably will be focusing more on agriculture, on mining, on tourism, on transportation, which are relatively carbon intensive. And these sectors' technical pathways need to be clearly identified towards net zero. And I feel that in Africa, there are many SMEs, and also equity investment is probably very important for funding these MNC SMEs before they can go for the debt financing. And also capacity building, I think, will be a serious, question that we need to answer in terms of helping firms to produce a transition plan, helping the financial institutions to assess the transition plan, and helping the firms to do their carbon accounting and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping that many of these bottlenecks can be addressed in our discussion, including from the Mercer report, which we commissioned starting from last year. And finally, let me just make a proposal, which is a collaboration between many organizations, NGOs, and platforms. For example, between Policy Center for New South, we can consider collaboration not only with the GIP Africa chapter, but also with a new platform my team has launched called CASI, Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment. That's a platform which now involves 60 global organizations dedicated for capacity building in green finance for emerging markets, developing economies. And we're aiming to host some CASI events in Africa. So in the future, I'm looking forward to opportunities to jointly organize such events and hoping that these events can help enhance capacity for the users, including financial institutions and corporates, to use transition finance instruments going forward. Once again, let me thank the host for organizing this event and wish the event great success.
Thank you very much. So after these rounds of remarks, I am pleased to invite now Mr. Jonathan Krauss, who is Senior Sustainable Investment Consultant at Mercer, to present key figures and findings of the GIP report. The floor is yours.
Many thanks. So on behalf of the Mercer team, we are delighted to be partnering with GIP in this important area, with the report serving as a contribution to the GIP Africa chapter. Partnering for Transition, which is the name of the report, brings the asset owner perspective to the GIP Africa chapter and builds on previous collaborations with 91, alongside contributions from the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds and the Bank of Africa, for which we are grateful. The output of the report is a finance and transition framework that institutional investors can use to confidently invest in key areas and sectors to support the low carbon transition in Africa. It builds towards a transition roadmap for Africa, noting that it is not a homogeneous region, the solutions required, and showcases successful case studies unique to Africa's economic and political context. During the report planning, one of the first things that became clear was the need to define upfront what was meant by transition and transition finance, and this has been covered to some extent by previous esteemed speakers. It is often tempting to think of transition as the process of moving an economy reliant on fossil fuels to an economy driven by green energy. However, this is not always the case. Carbon reduction needs to be considered alongside investment in economies with emissions that are yet to peak, be that due to population growth and increasing energy demand. The transition also needs to take into account, as has been already highlighted, the role of nature, adaptation to the physical impacts of climate change, adoption of circular economy approaches, and support for the principles of equality. In practice, this means thinking about transition as the change from a start state to an end state, where the start state may be very different depending on the region. Even within regions, the position may be nuanced. For example, within Africa, the transition in South Africa will have a focus on the just transition from a fossil fuel-driven economy, and this will look different to Kenya, for example, with its burgeoning renewables, which will again look different to Gabon with its significant natural capital. And so the report, therefore, encourages adoption of a broad definition of transition. This then has implications for how we think about transition finance. It is often, transition finance often forms part of the areas of sustainable finance, which covers broad integration of ESG factors. Impact finance, which aims to accelerate the transition of the real economy based on intentionality, additionality, and impact measurements. Green finance, which looks beyond environmental and covers all areas of environment, rather, including biodiversity protection and restoration. Climate finance, which looks at climate change mitigation and adaptation. Transition finance has an overlapping scope with all of those, but with a focus on supporting the energy transition alongside resilience. And it can cover decarbonisation of high-emitting activities, managed phase-outs, and ultimately investment that supports realisation of a low-carbon economy. It certainly requires consideration of regions, sectors, and timelines for transition. The report focuses on 3 different investor types, maximising its applicability to institutional investors. First, global investors with emerging market exposure, net zero investors with a focus on the global transition to a low carbon economy, and emerging market investors, some of which are looking to attract capital into their regions. The work also covered a review of available transition finance frameworks, certainly including the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group output, completion of asset owner surveys, interviews with a range of industry actors, alongside a review of the solution landscape. The key challenges and questions that the report addresses cover what frameworks currently exist, what are their strengths and gaps in relation to supporting investors strategically allocate to Africa, what are the transition opportunities, what is the current landscape for solutions, be that from asset managers and investable projects that could be invested on a direct basis, how can case studies be used to effectively build investor confidence, how to incorporate stewardship and the concept of a fair or just transition, and what barriers need to be overcome and how can solutions be scaled. And we found that collaboration is indeed a key factor to address all of these questions. And so bringing together the desktop review of transition frameworks, surveys, and interviews, we developed a set of 6 common investor actions that could then be further detailed across the 3 investor groups that I mentioned earlier. These 6 actions were across the areas of advocate, commit, align, collaborate, de-risk, and report. That's coming up on screen right now. It's the next, so if we keep going another couple of slides, one more slide. Perfect. Ultimately, in the area of advocating, it is advocating for the transition in Africa. Committing, it's through establishing credible net zero and transition finance commitments that build demand signals for investable projects and innovation. Alignment brings into play setting policies and approaches that are consistent with these commitments, using frameworks to categorize assets that fulfill the objective, for example, taxonomies, as well as incorporating an awareness of sectoral and regional differences. Again, emphasizing the importance of collaboration with multiple stakeholders. That means development banks, the climate finance sector, but also the local private sector in Africa, to build that local knowledge, work to establish an enabling regulatory and investment environment that ultimately supports accessibility. Further, building on some of the comments previously around key challenges, ultimately looking to de-risk certain investments, be that through blended finance, guarantees and long-term FX hedging, that often make use of international partners. This will ultimately support the affordability of investments. And finally, reporting. I think this is key to increasing accountability across institutional investors, whereby target allocations to climate solutions in emerging markets and developed economies are set and then reported against over time. The intention is that these steps, and as I said, there are more specific steps for each of the three investor types, will practically equip investors to better mobilize capital for the low carbon transition in Africa. I wanted to spend the last couple of minutes talking about developments since publishing the report, and I'd like to highlight the following key ones. In particular, building the quantitative case for investment in emerging markets and frontier markets. So going beyond a business case that focuses on the need for capital or the fact that there's that investment can support, can mitigate systemic risk within portfolios, given net zero for some does not mean net zero for all. So there is work going on within Mercer and beyond that looks at building the economic case for investment on a standalone basis. And this builds on findings around GDP growth, population growth on the continent, the fact that on a forward-looking basis, developing economies are expected to grow by 4% in both 2023 and 2024, according to the IMF, whereas advanced economies around 1.5% in 2023 and 1.4% in 2024. So ultimately, there is now a case using quantitative analysis that looks at risk, return and diversification metrics that can build a compelling case, especially across the private market landscape. This ultimately is about creating space within investors' strategic asset allocations to have a more durable strategic focus on these markets. Bringing down risk perception is the second one. This is key and has already been mentioned. And we are pleased to see significant developments in the area of data. I would call out the Global Emerging Markets Risk Database Consortium, increased data availability there across investments made by multilateral development banks, understanding the returns, the default rates, the recovery rates, and really providing some transparency around the actual level of risk in these markets. Secondly, funds with significant track record are bringing increased transparency to the level of risk in the region. The third area there, under bringing down risk perception, is also there is now increased networks connecting institutional investors with investment opportunities at the project and deal level, again providing that much needed transparency. The third circle on the page covers the industry guidance, which again is increasingly supportive of the direction of travel that's being posited in the paper and the report. For net zero investors in particular, I would call out the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change and their Net Zero Investment Framework. This is a widely used guide by investors looking to set net zero targets. The latest paper, which came out within the last month, certainly reframes decarbonisation targets as decarbonisation objectives and seeks to shift the focus from reducing financed emissions to financing reduced emissions, which I think is central to the discussion that we're having today. It also calls out what they refer to as STEM emissions, which are associated with climate solutions, transition assets, and in particular emerging markets. So again, we see this as positive. The other area there, building on the point I made around regional and sectoral diversification, is there's an increasing toolkit for investors to look at and understand different trajectory paths depending on different regions in the world. And the final point I would make in terms of developments, but also looking to the future, is around the interaction with the new collective quantified goals. So these are financial targets for public finance to support developing countries in their climate actions after 2025. And building on all the work that has been done to date and recognizing that public capital will need to be coupled with private capital, it will be important that these efforts across actors are aligned now and into the future. So with that, I'll leave it there. That's a summary of the report findings and the recent developments.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your insightful remarks. So our next session is a fireside chat that would be followed also by a short Q&A session that would be moderated by Rongrong Huo, who is Managing Director and Head of International Business at 91. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rim. Thank you for all the speakers earlier, all your leadership, and we are really grateful to be here. So this session built nicely on the back of what Jonathan has very well articulated in terms of the key messages. But before we get into the content a bit more, I think it's important that we understand some of the priorities, both from the Policy Center for the New Thoughts, as well as the newest partner that, both Policy Center and GIP are delighted to work with, which is the Cambridge Sustainability Research Institute. So with that in mind, may I start with you, Hafez? You obviously has done a lot in your career so far. You now focus for the Policy Center. Please share with us a bit more about your focus, especially how you see the world unfolding.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Well, the focus of our work at the Policy Center so far has been really in three areas. The work linked to the green transition and has been focused in three areas. The first one is on debt and climate financing. There's something that has not been mentioned so far, which is nearly half of our countries in Africa are either in debt distress or are facing or are in a high risk of debt distress. So one of our areas of our work has been we have developed a proposal that was presented to the G20 last year on a debt for climate initiative, where similar to what was done in the HIPEX initiative, which is to reduce countries' debt in return for climate investments. Also working on debt, because there's today many of those countries are paying more in debt service than they're spending on health or education, and they also need to spend more on climate, whether on adaptation or mitigation, and that cannot happen unless we really deal with it. The second area where we have been working on that, and also actually it is something that we have sent to the G20 and it will be published. It's a joint work that we're doing with the Brookings Institution, and that will be published later in August by the T20, is focusing on how to deal with the private debt in Africa. The structure of debt has changed in Africa, with many countries actually having sold Eurobonds, and how to deal with that debt. So this is one area of work. If you want to release public financing for the transition in Africa, you need also to deal with the debt issue. The second area that we are working on is the whole area of innovative financing for climate. And there are three issues that I would like to mention quickly. The first one, as we know that most of climate financing has to come from the private sector. Africa needs $1.3 trillion of investment every year for climate and the SDGs. The vast majority of that money has to be from the private sector, and actually the vast majority, the biggest financing ticket item will be in the energy transition, which is a private sector. So we have been working on looking at the current international institutions and whether they are able to provide this kind of financing. And our argument has been, well, we worry that, for example, if you ask the World Bank to do more climate financing, that would have be at the cost of doing less education, less health financing. When you ask when you review the African policymakers and you ask them what areas would you like international institutions to focus on, health, education, food security, those are the top three. Climate comes quite low. So we have been suggesting that we need to create a new instrument, a new institutional instrument, like a green bank, an African green bank or an international green bank that would be a public-private partnership. And that would focus on two things. One is to really build the project pipeline. Mr. Benjelloun mentioned that in his opening statement, and he's absolutely right. We have an underdeveloped project pipeline for the transition in Africa. So we need to build that project pipeline, and then that bank would also finance through equity and loans. But it has to be a public-private partnership. We do not think that a purely public bank can do the job. Then we have been also working on in the whole area of green bonds and how to attract financing for low-cost financing for the transition. And I believe that we can actually raise a lot of money inside Africa itself with the green bonds. One example that we did a few years back in my previous life was to sell what we called rhino bonds in South Africa, which were bonds to finance investments to save the rhinoceros in South Africa. And these were sold at way below the going interest rate. And people were buying them because people wanted to save the rhinos. And I think that if put in well described kind of green bonds or transition bonds in Africa can attract a lot of financing. People will buy it not because of the return, but people will buy it because they want to finance the transition in Africa. Also in the area of innovative financing, carbon credits and creating a carbon market is a very important area. Potentially, it could raise a lot of financing for Africa. Right now, we have some carbon markets that are voluntary. Maybe we need to think about how to actually make carbon markets work better, maybe through carbon taxation and so on, which is very difficult. Finally, a last area of work that is very important for Africa is to strengthen on the governance of the international financial system, and it is to strengthen Africa's voice in global financial governance. We're talking a lot about what Africa needs in financing and so on, and what the IMF, the World Bank, the other international institutions should be doing. But we forget that those institutions were created 80 years ago, and that actually at Bretton Woods, only 4 African countries participated. Today, we have 54 African countries. And when you look at the voice of Africa, I'll give you just one number. Nigeria, the largest African country, which has a population of 228 million people, its share of the quota of the IMF is 0.52%. This is less than half of Switzerland's share of the quota of the IMF. So a lot of our work is also focusing on how to enhance and improve Africa's voice, so that Africa's voice is heard in the global financial system. So let me stop here now. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Hafez. Thank you so much for sharing all these exciting things. I think all of us have been nodding hard because everything that you touch on are crucial, right? Unlocking finance, really thinking about the role of public and private sector capital, think about systematic change to bring prosperity and, climate or wider sustainability agenda together. That's the second part of big work. And thinking about global voices, representing for Africa, but broadly for the emerging markets. So we are so delighted that we are learning from you, want to build on that. So we'll come to you a bit more on the collaboration, because I think that would be interesting to get your perspectives. But maybe I just move to Sibu for now. Sibu, to tell us a little bit about the University of Cambridge, the Sustainability Leadership Program, and what are your current focus or your colleagues together?
Thank you so much, Rong, and thank you to everyone here. Thanks to the Policy Center for the New South. I think I've come across some of your colleagues in previous work, so it's great to engage again with you. So for CISL, I think let me lay it out this way. We've had an Africa office in South Africa for 20 years, and it's really been focused on executive education, so especially for business people. So, for example, Business and Sustainability Program for seniors, and then recently also the Sustainability Practitioner Program, looking at people who actually are in practice and actually advising and doing the work in businesses. But one of the things we've realized is that we need to get out of the South African bubble, but also the executive education bubble, and consider what is needed on the African continent. And there's climate, there's the transition, there's all sorts of things, right? But we also are very aware that Cambridge is a British university. It's in the global north. And so you also need to partner with people who are working in these areas on the continent itself. We can't do this alone. And so we're considering, so one of the things that we've done is form corporate leaders groups, one in Nairobi and one in Johannesburg. So the one in Nairobi is a Sustainability Leadership Forum. It consists of about 12 members who are sustainability chiefs in their companies in that region, East Africa. And in South Africa, in Johannesburg, we've got corporate affairs leaders in combination with an agreement with the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, because they're a regulator. And for listed companies, it's quite important for them to know what the stock exchange has to say about sustainability and transition and the bonds and all the solutions that we're talking about here. So I think there's lots of space in partnership with others to do more and also to be context specific. For example, one of the three areas CISL is looking to work on over the next few years is around bending the curve on nature. Financing the transition. What does that actually mean? Because it's different in each country, in each region, and at different speeds. And then also enabling leadership for a sustainable economy. I mean, after all, we're a leadership institute. So how do you support leaders? So for the Africa program, a key part is making sure that we do work with leaders at government level who understand finance. Earlier we were talking about green bonds or transition bonds. Does a person sitting in the Ministry of Finance understand what a green bond means for their country? And how do you get them to understand this? So, for example, we've sort of built about 4 archetypes at the moment of African countries and where they are. And I think it connects quite nicely with what other speakers have spoken about earlier. So there are countries that need to transition away from fossil fuel economies. So you take South Africa, for example. Nigeria is a big one. And how do you do that? How do you plug into the leadership to help them do that? So South Africa just recently signed a Climate Change Act into law, I think a few days ago. And that also now lays out legally what can be done with carbon markets in South Africa much more clearly. And I think that's an opportunity and a space to tap into, because it could be a model for some countries, but not others. Another one is looking at countries that need to develop and access new energy systems. So if you think about Senegal, for example, so there's oil that's been tapped, but how does Senegal take the solar that they have potential and turn it into something that actually works? Or those that need to exploit key minerals, because critical minerals are causing other geopolitical headaches, to be frank. And so what do you do for DR Congo and its leadership, or Namibia? And I think agriculture has been mentioned earlier. It's still very important. So for a country like Malawi, how do you do development with agriculture at the center of it, and with climate change and the transition taking place? And I think lastly, looking at countries that really have been impacted hugely by climate change, and it's only going to get worse. So, and sliding into deeper debt, you look at Mozambique and Madagascar. So these are all different archetypes of what's happening on the continent, and there's different solutions for each and certain regions and groups. So I think it's an exciting time to do this and to work on it, but be cognizant of the complexity of the space that we're in. Thanks, Roman.
No, thank you so much for sharing. We really look forward to tap into the corporate work and some other works that Cambridge has been doing or leading. And I see this huge complementary between all the parties, so among all the parties. So it should be very exciting. Just asking Hafez a little bit more on the collaboration. I think, on the ground, which us all included, are very keen to work together. But across the regions, we have lots of Western-led initiatives. Do you think they understand the emerging market transition, or are there anything that's significant missing that we should be addressing on?
Yes. No, I think collaboration amongst African countries and across different regions is extremely important. I mean, Karim El Ayanoui made a key point when he talked about how the world is fragmenting geopolitically. In the current geopolitical context, where we are no longer in a globalized world, but moving more towards a less globalized world, it's important first of all, for African countries to cooperate and to work together. Regionalization is one solution to deal with a fragmenting world. And that is especially the case for smaller African countries, because we now need to work. We don't want to choose sides between the different great powers in the world. We want to work with China. We want to work with the West. And we need to be able to do that. And if we stick together, we can talk to China, we can talk to the West. If each one of the 54 countries is left alone, we are not able to do that. So that is, I think, a very important point about regional cooperation should be a high priority for African countries. And going back, especially to the point that we are discussing, we are talking about the transition. Now, as we said, most of us actually were saying, including also, I was listening very carefully to what Jonathan Cross was saying. The need is mainly for private sector investment in Africa, and I would say mainly in the energy transition, which is an opportunity for Africa. It's not just moving from. I mean, everybody's focusing on South Africa, moving from the coal-led power systems to more sustainable power systems. But actually, we should also focus on the nearly half of Africans who have no power at all, have no electricity at all. And maybe we should invest in those areas and start with clean energy for them. This is a clear win for Africa and win for the climate. So we have to ask ourselves, why is this investment not happening? And that's where both governments, private sector, international institutions need to work together. One of the reasons, the main reason why those investments are not happening is the perception of risk that many people have talked about already. Perception of risk, which I think is highly exaggerated, is and the reason it's exaggerated is that companies have very little experience in Africa. I mean, the more knowledge you get, the better you're able to manage risks, and the better you are able to estimate the risk. Lack of knowledge makes you feel that the risk is very high. So there is just information sharing, and producing information about Africa and what's happening there is important. Then we need to we need to have a collaboration between the governments, the international institutions, foreign partners to de-risk. And let us think about what kinds of risks are the private investors facing when they come to Africa. And there are two major risks. The first one is contractual. If you're going to go and produce, say, electricity, you're going to sell it to the grid. You want to make sure that you get paid, and that's usually a contract with the government. And there are ways of mitigating that risk. We can think of providing guarantees. Guarantees. I mean, international institutions can provide guarantees. Other countries can provide guarantees, but you can provide at least partial guarantees to deal with the risk of actually the sovereign not meeting its contractual obligation, like if you're selling to the grid and you're not getting paid. The second risk, which is more difficult to deal with, is macroeconomic risks. And that is where, because, I mean, if you're going to be paid in Nigerian nairas, and you don't know what will happen to the naira's exchange rate, actually, it's a good example because the naira had depreciated a lot over the last year. So you want to be able to deal with that risk, and there are markets for that. There are markets for dealing with the risk, but also African countries need to be doing better in terms of managing their macroeconomies and informing, providing information about what's happening in their macroeconomies, so that private investors can actually better estimate the macro risk that they are facing and find ways of mitigating it. The exchange rates, you can always, as I was saying, you can always do swaps and so on. Finally, my last point on that is that we often, when we're talking about private investment in Africa, we are often thinking about foreign investors. But actually, we have a huge African private sector. And we need to encourage this private sector to invest in the transition. And what we forget often is that the African private sector is facing the same risks as the foreign private sector, especially in terms of they have better information, but they have the same risk, especially in terms of the sovereign not meeting its contractual obligations. So in many cases, in many other fora that I have participated in, the focus has been on providing guarantees, for example, for private investment, for foreign private investment. I believe that we should think about providing the same kinds of guarantees for domestic private investment, and you could also actually get much more mileage there. So thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Hafez. You give us so much thoughts. Conscious of time, and Sibu, I just maybe invite you to give a very brief comments on some of the thinking for next step, collaboration. Then I will pass the floor back to Rim for the other perspectives.
Thank you. I think one of the key things that's going to take place, obviously, is the G20 being held in South Africa next year, and also the African Union becoming a member of the G20. So some people calling it G20 plus one, and I think we need to tap into that as people working in this space and collaborating. I think there's huge opportunity. I know we have been asked to help with the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20, and considering that it's moved from India to Brazil this year, and then also into Africa next year. And so I think the space to extend some of the work that we've been doing, but to get more specifically nuanced, I think, as Hafez has mentioned, some of the solutions are there, but we need to get specific about how we push them out. And also the issue of guarantees, I think, is so important, because the issue, we talk about debt, but also a lot of African countries pay their debt on time, and they have to pay more for it. And that does not make sense. Why are you higher risk, but you pay on time and you do it exactly right? So I think there's places and spaces to work on together, considering the G20 in the background. Thanks.
Thank you. And we look forward for our collective collaboration in partnership with GIP, the CASI, and of course, our host. So Rim, may I pass the floor back to you? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rong. Since we are running a little bit behind of time, I will directly move to you, Cheng Lin. So you're head of GIP Secretariat, Director of International Collaboration at the Beijing Institute of Finance and Sustainability. So you are going to share with us the GIP Africa 2024-2025 perspectives.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rim. And before actually coming to what you just said about the upcoming work plan for the GIP African chapter under the 2024-2025, I just want to provide a few maybe reflections on what I heard from today's discussants. Very good. A few points. Maybe firstly, as a response to what Mr. Hafez just said about the three priorities they are working on in Africa. One thing is debt and climate financing. I know there is also a specific mechanism called debt for nature, debt for climate, and so on. And second thing is about innovative or innovative financing for Africa. I think you just mentioned that there is quite a lot of debate on the prioritization for the different areas of focus for the energy sector, for the finance sector, including financing for the energy, the food, education, and then come back to climate and maybe other sustainability-linked things. And third thing is the reform of the governance structure of the international financial system. So all the three topics and focus areas actually are very much relevant to what we do today. And also, of course, what we do tomorrow. And of course, when I say tomorrow, it's maybe the next year or the years to come. So also has a very close link to the GIP African chapter's work priority for the next year. I just want to say for the governance reform of the international financial system, that has been coming to my mind through different approaches, including today and also a few weeks ago when I was speaking with a friend from France. They were also talking about the change. I think one possible way is, and also as a response to the case made by Mr. Hafez, is about the voting rights enjoyed by Nigeria in the IMF. While Nigeria has 250 million people, their voting rights is only less than 1%, and maybe even less, not comparable with Switzerland. So just one thing is that some of the countries already realize that actually the need for structural change to the international financial architecture is already at the door front. And everyone needs to admit that we need to do something to it, although there are some barriers ahead. I heard some countries already want to say they want to increase their contribution to the international organizations like IMF while forfeiting some of their voting rights. I contribute more, but actually I do not want to enjoy higher voting rights, just want to leave the space for other developing countries. And another perspective is that maybe some of the existing either international or regional development organizations are already innovating in terms of governance structure. So they have different layers of governance structures. I mean, the financial contribution they can contribute and also the voting rights they share can be unequal, which is already evident in the equity market. So you are more like an equity shareholder, and let's say I'm a shareholder, Amor is another shareholder. The company get listed, but we actually our voting rights is not assigned based on the ratio of the share rights we hold. So maybe it's not appropriate case, but I think, for example, in the governance structure of the government, let's say in the UK, there's upper house, there's lower house, and they are voted actually, or they are chosen or elected based on maybe two different perspectives. So one is based on the share of the GDP from the different regions, while the other layer is chosen or elected based on the population. So let's say if we can also learn from that to reform some of existing international financial system, let's say the IMF, can we give them two voting structures based on the contribution or the share of the GDP and of the share global population? It will be fairer, especially in terms of population. I think the global south will have a larger share. And of course, how we contribute the shares also something needs to be discussed. But anyway, there might be something we can contribute, especially when the just elements is considered across different countries, across different continents for the climate mitigation or adaptation. And then maybe something coming from the viewpoints of what Sibu just said about the G20 presidency next year is South Africa. I think it's very critical because we do not want to expect to see something happen 2017-16 happen again. So in 2016-17, especially in 17 and 18, so when the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group by then was created in 2016 and suddenly came to a stop in 2018, after 2018, well, due to some change in the state's administration. And then actually a lot of people are also expecting to see maybe something similar. What are we going to do if in the G20, well, it's G21, right? African Union joined. And after South Africa, I think South Africa won't be big issue, but after that, the US will be the presidency. And also it's going to be more dramatic if something happened again in the climate change agenda. So that's something I think we need to consider. And one response to the change in 2017, when the Green Finance Study Group stopped operation, actually the born of the NGFS, Central Banks and the Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, happened. And now that group or that network has grown from, in the beginning, only 7 or 8 founding members now to a membership of more than 120. So it's more represented than the G20 in terms of either countries or the population or the GDP. And I think it's more professional and also still lasting until today. And so that's more like a very quick response to some of the points discussed today. And then a few more points about what I heard. For example, I heard in the very beginning about the maybe the local debate in terms of policy making on what to prioritize. Do we need to prioritize on development, or do we need to prioritize on the transition of existing, let's say, carbon-intensive sectors in Morocco? And maybe it's the same case in many countries in other African continent or other African countries. I think we don't have to debate in the end. It's probably more like a balance. So how much we need to spend with limited physical space and also limited financial resources. And that's going to be also two stories. So on the fiscal part, I think we need to focus on both the development and also some decarbonization, especially not all sectors. And Africa only emits less than 3% of the global carbon or other greenhouse gas. But I think we need to choose maybe 2 or maybe 3 the top sectors that are emitting and contributing the significant amount on the ratio of the GHG, and then do something about transition, while still focus on the green investments. We know the infrastructure in Africa needs to be in place. And the good news is that it can jumpstart with the investments for green. They can start with green rather than start with some polluting way of manufacturing or living. So that's more like something I guess we can do something as well. And the second thing is about the capacity building, which leads to the second part of what I just said. So both the fiscal and also private. I think Hafez also made a point that in Africa, we do have sizable private sector funds, and they need to be greened to make sure actually we have the funds. And we cannot rely too much on external investments from our side as ODI or as FDI. And they can maybe contribute to up to lower single-digit percentage of the gross formation of the fixed assets in single country, but they can never go up to 20% or even higher. That means we still need to rely on local resources that's available, and most of them are also private sector funds. And one case can be used to, let's say, we green the local investments, we green the local loans. And I think Jonathan Cross said there is a switch from, let's say, decarbonize financed emissions to finance the reduction of the emissions. That's about the same thing. Can we green the finance or finance green? We actually can do both. It's about process and prioritization. In Africa, I think we shall also do more things on green the local financial system. This is also a focus of the NGFS. So with that in mind, I think the GIP's African chapter for the next year and in terms of priority has been very clear for me. One thing is, of course, build capacity to make sure we can also green the investments and green the financial system in Africa. And since we are based in Morocco and also we have a lot of colleagues, for example, 91 has a very strong presence in South Africa, and the G20 presidency will be South Africa next year. I think green the local financial system will be key. And the second thing is we continue with the research. So last year with the support from Mercer, I think that's a great piece of work done on the transition finance is from the asset owner's point of view. And now we can move on and see which sectors can be prioritized from other perspectives. And since we are talking about the sectoral perspective, then the bank lending, project investment, project financing probably will be also prioritized for our next research. So after this call and after this event, we probably will discuss with both Sibu and probably with Jonathan again on how and what we can do together, and also with support from local partners like the Policy Center for the New South. And of course, other stakeholders are strongly welcomed. And before concluding, a few, maybe two things to talk about. One thing is, or three things, three events actually. One thing is that deal making. So since we know the African continent's actually in high demand of investments for the local green projects. So in early September, September 10th, 11th, there will be a deal making opportunity happening in Hong Kong to be organized by Hong Kong Trade and Development Council. They welcome African-based green infrastructure projects which are asking for financing. Please reach out to us or maybe reach out directly to the Hong Kong TDC. They are organizing a deal-making process in those 2 days in Hong Kong in person, and also that can also be accessed through online. And today, Amo is here and Ron is online. I think with their support, you can reach out to them separately because they are also committed to helping the stakeholders, the project owners in Africa to access the Hong Kong TDC opportunity and also the green financing opportunity. And the second thing is the GIP's next annual meeting. It's going to be happening in Beijing. Of course, it's going to be also accessible through online platforms on September the 18th. And this will be an opportunity for us to review what's happened in the past year and also what will be planned for the next year from the GIP as a whole. Of course, we'll be inviting the different working groups, the co-chairs of all the three regional chapters, including Africa, Southeast Asia, and also Central Asia. So this is going to be also a good opportunity for everyone, including those online and also attending in person, to join us. And lastly, it's about the capacity building. Since I said, many policymakers, financiers, and also project owners, they also want to do green financing. They probably do not know how to do it. And this is a capacity challenge and also constraint. So in September, on September the 23rd and 24th, the Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment is going to host an in-person event focusing on the Middle East and on North Africa to build capacity on sustainable investment, including policy frameworks, including the the risk mitigation, the origination and pipelines of the green projects, and also any concerns with green and transition washing. So we also probably will link the discussion to some sectoral opportunities and applications, including the chemicals, the carbon trading, aviation, for example, the sustainable aviation fuel, and chemicals, I think I already mentioned, the energy and transportation and so on. So more information will be provided available through our colleagues here and online, and also through the CASI's website. So with that, let me just pass it back to Remy.
Thank you very much. I have been told that we are running out of time, so perhaps we will move directly to the closing remarks. I know it's a very interesting topics that so there are so many things to say, but we'll go straight to you, Amal.
Hello? Yes, perfect. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for these very, very insightful remarks. I think I'll be very brief, and I'll focus on the essentials. First of all, on behalf of the Bank of Africa team and Mr. Brahim Benjelloun, thank you very much for all our partners, for the Policy Center for being our host. Minister Bousta, this began by a conversation to say, wait, transition finance, yes, we're interested, GIP, and then we made it happen. So thank you very much, your team's professionalism and diligence. Thank you to GIP, always, keeping us focused on building capacity and really building this network of GIP supporters for Africa and beyond. We also want to thank our partners, Casablanca Finance City, and also outside of Morocco, the West African Development Bank, which is one of the supporters of GIP Africa. Thank you very much to Mr. Karim El Ayanoui for gracing us with his presence this morning with his very busy agenda. It's really very well appreciated. And I think to recap what everyone agrees on, I want to remind that GIP, I mean, what's the interest for a commercial bank to join GIP Africa? It's very simple. For us, we've been historically, for the last 20 years, on the lead regionally on sustainable finance, and we found GIP to be the first emerging economy-focused initiative, not focused on purely green, but on really the realities on the ground, and this is where we meet the Policy Center. In addition to capacity building, not only do we need to include the Global South, but we need to also, maybe you mentioned one thing I didn't hear today, is technology transfer. We've heard from Dr. Majroun that over 10 municipalities are already piloting transition. There's things there that we need to see and bring back here to the continent and really transfer the right clean technologies at a faster, more scalable rate. Rong, good to see you virtually. Thank you, Jonathan Cross, Dr. Hafiz Ghanem, and the CICEL, which I look forward to getting to know deeply as well with my colleagues. And I think suffice it to say that we look forward to the next step of this transition report. So stay tuned for part 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amal. Mr. Shaidi, do you have any few words for conclusion?
Thank you for all. Thank you for Bank of Africa and for the GIP for this opportunity to discuss together on a very complex issue. And I think that all the partners and the debater has mainly highlighting what it is important to produce a new narrative for this transition, energetic and in climate finance in Africa. And I think that the key risks of private investors on the continent is a very, very important question. So many ideas are highlighted in this debate. I think that to clarify the narrative of the finance needs for just transition Africa, in Africa, how just transition finance is going to be, or is it a very important key in ensuring no one is left behind this situation. And African countries can develop to low carbon and to resilient economies, but without sacrificing growth and prosperity. That is the main point I think it's important to highlight. The second is the financing landscape in Africa has many or faces many challenges and opportunities for just transition. Generally, African countries have a low level of public resources, and domestic resources are also very low. So this raises the question of how much should be financed this transition. It should be financed by a collaboration between public and private sector in all the countries. Should be financing also by cooperation between African institution and finance and multilateral institution. And it is the veritable challenge is to coordinate all this opportunity between all these actors and to be innovative in financing in instruments and mechanisms, because it is a very complex issue. So I think that it is important also to develop the collaboration and the partnership between the financial institution and the think tank institution on working on these issues, because it's not only in in short term, but it is a challenge in the long term. Thank you for your collaboration.
Thank you very much, CJD. So I have been informed by our colleagues that you have a reaction from our audience. Can you please identify yourself and be very quick?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you for enabling me to just come on for a minute. This is Yassine Anwar. I'm the chairman of the Central Asia chapter for GIP. I've been very impressed with the comments made by all my esteemed colleagues, and I just want to take a couple of minutes to wrap up. Mr. Hafiz made some very good points. Obviously, he's got a background in banking, which I also have, and I'd like to mention a couple of areas that were important here in this effort. Regional integration and cooperation, very essential. I was a speaker at Cassie's keynotes as a keynote in Hong Kong last month, and I mentioned a couple of these things. A couple of points are very important. One, regional integration. Central Asia is one of the least integrated regions in the world. ASEAN region is about 24-25%, and Europe and the United States or North America is about 65%. When you had global financial crisis, these exogenous shocks were felt by these countries, but this is where we need to protect ourselves. So that's one. A couple of other speakers mentioned three key points: coordination, cooperation, collaboration. These are the hallmarks to accessing success or achieving success in transition finance. And the reason I cite this is because access to finance is the key to this Africa chapter, as well as the Global South and emerging markets. The success in this area is available, and many people have not been able to harness the energies and synergies associated with capital and liquidity around the world that we have. It has been tested in the past, in the 70s and 80s, when North African countries like Sonatrach and BMCE, with the largest phosphates deposits, were used as collateral to support financing by major U.S. institutions and multilaterals. Now that synergy is there today, and that access to finances needs to be managed properly. One of the areas, the key areas, for example, is export credit agencies and multilaterals. The largest financial institutions of Chinese and the United States in the top 10. These balance sheets are huge, to enable them to leverage and provide the synergies associated with the capital that is available. But obviously the high risk associated with Mr. Hafiz mentioned and a couple of other colleagues and other private-public partnerships. How do you access the private capital? They're not going to be coming on until you manage the risk that they're associated with. Well, one of the key reasons, for example, in Central Asia, one example is Mongolia. 90% of its energy is derived from fossil fuels. They just launched last year a 60 million green bond with IFC that is going to invest in green bonds. These partnerships with multilaterals will mitigate the risk associated with private capital being attracted because stability and continuity is what they want. That in itself will open up the floodgates to the asset managers like BlackRock and others that have huge investors that are looking for socially responsible investments. That's a trend with the younger generation that has come forward today. So these steps I'm highlighting very quickly, and we don't run out of time, is I wanted to share this with you. Anything that we can do in the Central Asian chapter to support this exercise in Africa, we'll be glad to do so. For example, getting the capacity building and education in Central Asia, we got the State Bank of Pakistan that is up to speed in ESRM guidelines in the board level, and all the ISSB guidelines are also adopted there. The Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and all the other countries. So we're glad to help in providing that webinar or association with these entities to help Africa where it's needed. But regional integration cooperation is the hallmark to success. And I endorse what Hafiz had mentioned earlier. Obviously, like myself, a banking background, we share the same objectives. These are challenges that are many, but I think we can achieve them, but we have to go together in a cooperative fashion. And the common denominator for the two largest economies, the United States and China, is climate change. We must get them to collaborate more so. The geopolitical tensions are not going to be helpful, but we must work together to highlight these challenges that must be supportive of this common denominator for the benefit of the global South, emerging market economies that are essential for the global success of our planet. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for this extra time.
Thank you very much. I think we're behind a little bit the schedule, so we will close the webinar now. Thank you again for your experience and sharing with us your insights, and thank you to our audience.